And I have to say, James Monroe, to me, was never until recently, James Monroe was very much a secondary figure. He's considered as the last founding father as president, because he was in the Revolutionary War and considered in a minor sort of way a founding father, but still a very secondary sort of figure to me, and the type of guy I would not think of as a great man or someone with any sort of gravitas to his character. And I'm happy to say now that I have a greater appreciation for his talents and his skill in diplomacy and running a government. He has a lot more to him than I had thought initially. To our bibliography, Gary Hart, James Monroe. We all know Gary Hart, don't we? Mr. Monkey Business himself. I hope you know that reference. You can ask me afterwards if you don't. Gary Hart. Who would have known that Gary Hart was also a scholar? But yeah, nicely done, short biography of James Monroe. He relies a lot, and this is a lot of these. This was in. Okay, let me start again. This is a series of books, and I think I mentioned this before, by a particular publisher that covers all of the presidents, and they chose various historians and scholars to write individual biographies. And so some of these biographies in this series are written by the experts in the field, and some of them are written by journalists and just scholars of one sort or another who aren't necessarily experts in the field, but are good scholars nonetheless. And so Gary Hart, being a scholar, was asked to write this particular biography, and he did a competent job for a short biography. Lots and lots of reliance on the great scholars of the past who are, the experts in the field. So he does a lot of quoting of the more expert, well-renowned scholars on James Monroe. Still nicely done. Noble E. Cunningham, The Presidency of James Monroe, 245 pages. A full picture, for the most part. This is another series, actually, on the presidents, another publisher doing biographies of the presidents, only this series is just on the presidency rather than the whole life of the individual that they're writing about. Very political, not very personable, gives you a good rundown on the details of the presidency. So not generally fun reading, but not bad either. I wouldn't speak badly of it. This is a good look into the presidency and the political ins and outs of James Monroe. Harlow Giles Unger, The Last Founding Father. I really like this one. This guy writes in a much more engaging style, very personable, very witty, and it gives a very full picture of James Madison and a good understanding of his thinking and how he works with others. And then Tim McGrath, James Monroe, 738 pages. This one was a slog to get through. Not bad, very detailed. So all in all, It was not the best I've ever read, but not the worst. I'm spending way too much time with this. Okay, born April 28, 1758. Again, the last of the Virginia dynasty of presidents. Lieutenant in the Continental Army, Monroe was seriously injured working under Washington at the Battle of Trenton. He was in the Army up until, at Trenton, he was, as I said, very seriously wounded, almost lost his life, but recovered in a few months and continued working his way up the ranks till he was a lieutenant colonel, and then in 1780 decided to leave the Army and study law under Thomas Jefferson. And then he was a delegate to the Virginia ratifying convention, trying to decide whether Virginia would accept our Constitution or not. He voted against the Constitution because it did not have a Bill of Rights. That was very important to him. And the promises that were made at that time was that, look, we know a lot of people really want the Bill of Rights, or a Bill of Rights with our Constitution, so we promise once we have our government in place, we will draw up our basic Bill of Rights. Some people believed it, some people did not. Monroe said, you know what, I want to see it first before I vote on it. So he voted against, but they passed it anyway. And Monroe was a fairly popular figure after his presidency, or during his presidency, and so he was included in some very famous paintings. We all know this one, right? Washington crossing the Delaware. What you may not know is that this guy right here is James Monroe. In this, the capture of the Hessians at Trenton, he has a very small part in it, right here. Right behind this guy's hand is James Monroe, wounded and being held by another soldier. So this one was 1851, many years after the events, but he was such a figure still at that time that the artist felt that it would be important to include him in this painting. This one, we don't know when it was painted, but it was somewhat earlier than this. And again, thought might give him a small bit part in this painting. So his political career, he was senator in 1790. Ambassador to France, 94 to 96, governor of Virginia, 1799. He helped negotiate the treaty that got Louisiana, 1803. Of course, this was pretty much thrown in his lap by the foreign minister on instructions from Napoleon. But I think I mentioned before, this was something that went well beyond what his instructions were, and he said, that's okay, we want this. And then served as Madison's Secretary of State and Secretary of War once he got rid of the incompetence in his government. He got Monroe. Monroe was a well-known figure that he wanted very badly. Monroe had a bit of a rivalry earlier on with Madison, and Jefferson tried very hard to patch the two up. They both had ambitions in their political life and kind of bumped heads a little bit. But essentially, Monroe wanted to serve the country, and so so he decided to bury the hatchet. And so one thing that Monroe said to Madison, when Madison said, look, I really need you as my Secretary of State. I'm getting rid of this guy finally, this idiot that I've had to carry my first a few years in office, and I want you. Monroe had a bit of a grudge with Madison and Jefferson earlier on because he had helped negotiate a treaty with France back in 1806. They repudiated or basically said, thank you for your service, but we're not going to use it. And so that caused some hurt feelings with Monroe. But he recovered from it and basically said he would help the country in its dire need. And so he came to serve Madison in his cabinet for probably a year or more as both the Secretary of War and the Secretary of State. And then he became president. Election of 1816, in the era of good feelings. Wouldn't that be nice? Why can't we live in the era of good feelings? So, yeah. So, why was this the era of good feelings? Well, the war is done. We're past that now. The country is becoming more and more prosperous. The Industrial Revolution isn't arrived yet, but the precursors are. And a number of things are happening. Transportation is improving. People's lives are improving. And the Federalist Party is pretty much dead. We have a one-party system now. And everybody sees we're all now Republicans. Instead of Jefferson's old saying, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, now we're just all Republicans. The dying embers of the Federalist Party were still around, but they couldn't make waves anymore. And so now we have one strong, enthusiastic party, and we're all Republicans now. And Monroe is a nice guy. He was seen as very competent. He was a war hero, wounded badly in the Revolutionary War, served his state at the Constitutional Convention, and served in the cabinets under Madison, seen as a positive influence. So yeah, we like Monroe. So this is the era of good feelings now. The election of 1816, 84% of the Electoral College vote. One of the great landslides in our history.
Well, the vote's too large to be 2 votes per state.
Huh? Well, that's, well, I can't get into that too much because I am really behind, but we can talk about that later. So the social life of the Monroes. Elizabeth Monroe, certainly no Dolly Madison, but gracious in her own way, although suffering from rheumatoid arthritis through her later years in the office, presented well through her parties, glamorous though fragile. James Monroe is not the dour, sour-faced Madison, and could, even though he's not as glamorous as his wife, a very plain sort of dressed man, could be very gracious at a social function. They had levees once a week and lavish dinners for the congressmen that he had to pay for out of his own pocket. This was the practice. When the White House puts on a dinner, it's the president who pays for it. And Monroe went into debt paying for these lavish parties that the congressmen all wanted to come to. So it was a difficult time financially being president unless you are a fairly wealthy person. And it was also the practice since Washington's time that the president does not go to anyone else's party. If some individual throws a ball at his estate and invites the president says, no, I don't want to show partiality towards any individual. So you can come to my parties, but I'm not coming to yours. Even a foreign minister who would come and try to put on a lavish party of one sort or another and invites the president. When Monroe became president and invited to a gathering from some foreign minister, he kind of asked around, is this okay? Should I do this? And was told Washington never did, Adams never did, Jefferson never did, and Madison did not go to these parties. So no, you should not go. And he didn't. So here's Elizabeth Monroe, very nicely fashionable. After Dolly Madison, you'd have to try very hard just to keep up. And she was presentable, but she was no Dolly Madison. And then we come to Monroe's cabinet. Take a look at these guys. So we have John Quincy Adams, quite possibly the most talented Secretary of State ever in the office. And take a look at this guy, and you know all you need to know about John C. Calhoun. He was, just as his face says he is, a very dour, imposing, ominous sort of guy as Secretary of War. And somehow I messed up. William H. Crawford as Secretary of the Treasury. Each of these three would run for the presidency in 1824. Kind of a remarkable thing when you have your cabinet composed of very ambitious men who are going to all run for the presidency. Andrew Jackson in Florida. This is how basically we take Florida because of Andrew Jackson. He's after the marauding Seminole Indians who come out of Florida, attack small settlements, and run back into Florida, Spanish-owned at the time. And so Jackson wasn't having it. He didn't care if Florida belonged to Spain. He was going to chase them down. And he also would punish anyone who was inspiring them to attack. And he found a couple of British soldiers of fortune who he believed were inspiring and provoking the Indians to attack the settlements in the United States, in Georgia. So he hung them. And so simultaneously, Andrew Jackson is provoking war with both Great Britain and Spain. Kind of thing that Andrew Jackson did at that time. And of course, he had to provoke the governor of Spain and teach him a lesson too, and chased him out of Pensacola. So what do you do when, and by the way, you do something like that, and the people of the United States love you. He became a great hero, teaching those Indians who's the boss, teaching Spain a lesson, and Great Britain at the same time. So yeah, people loved him. So what do you do as president? Do you scold him for starting an international incident? Do you repudiate him, or do you celebrate him as the people of the United States was doing? Well, he walked the tightrope, trying to not ruffle any feathers either side. John Quincy Adams said, hey, we should own this. we're going to take Florida sooner or later anyway. Why not just support our great hero? And then, of course, on the opposite side, John C. Calhoun, who sees Andrew Jackson as a rival, and he should. He said, no, we need to repudiate him. We could arrest that guy for doing what he did. It was quite illegal. But James Monroe knew better than to take one side or the other, and so he walked the tightrope. So neither condemning nor endorsing. And then eventually Spain got the hint and realized that they were going to lose Florida one way or another, and so they negotiated for the sale of Florida in 1819. Okay, the election of 1820. Almost unanimous. There was no Federalist that was going to challenge Monroe for the presidency. He got almost every single vote. There was one guy, one delegate, one elector who said, no, I'm not going to give it to him. I don't want this to be unanimous. Now, he had two reasons for withholding his vote, and he actually gave it to John Quincy Adams, who wasn't even running for president. But he decided one reason was that he gave was that George Washington should be the only president who got a unanimous vote. Okay? I don't want anybody else to have a unanimous vote. He also believed that James Madison didn't deserve all of the credit for his administration. He didn't see him as a character that was all that impressive. So for those two reasons, he said, no, he's not going to get my vote. He'll get everybody else's, I know, but he's not going to get unanimously voted. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, we know that the rivalry between the North and the South, the slave states and the free states, was heating up. The southern states did not have the population of the northern states, so in the House of Representatives, they were weaker than the northern states. But in the Senate, it's evenly divided. Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, which would push them over the top. There would be more slave states than free states. And a lot of the people of the North decided, no, we do not want that. We do not want the southern slave states dominating the Senate. And so what to do? Well, they waited around for a year. And then Maine wanted to come in as a state, and that would be the free state that would be balancing out the slave and free states. And so from that time on, everybody knew we could only bring in states two at a time, one in the South, one in the North, to keep the balance. And this wasn't really a Monroe thing. I just threw that note in. This was all debated in the Congress, and they worked this system out. And Monroe, as a man from the South, born on a plantation with slaves, everybody knew his sympathies generally would be with the South, as they were. But he was not wanting to go against the North either. So, the big international issues of the day were mostly the Latin American countries. They were having their revolutions. They were separating from Spain. Brazil was separating from Portugal. And people of the United States could sympathize. Isn't this great? The revolutions that we started have inspired the Latin American countries also. And now they are gaining their independence. And so Monroe, as president, still wanted to be neutral. He was not wanting to take one side or the other, but everybody knew our sympathies were with the Latin American countries, but not wanting to provoke Spain or Portugal either. And at this time, we started letting the other countries know. We have Great Britain in Canada. We have the Russians in Alaska coming down the coast all the way to California. We want to let other countries know that we are not going to look favorably on any other colonization. We do not want people taking advantage of the countries that are declaring their independence. We don't want anybody helping Spain get those countries back. And so this is, through one incident or another, these are the messages that are going out from James Monroe's administration. And then finally, we have the Monroe Doctrine. There was a point at which there was a British foreign minister who started making hints. Maybe we should have a joint declaration. We're totally in favor of your position. There should not be any more colonization in the Americas. So how about if you and us create this joint declaration stating the principles that we're standing by, and letting the rest of the world know that we are not in favor of any more colonization or helping Spain or Portugal gain their colonies back. And so this was the big debate with James Monroe and his cabinet. Should we go along with Great Britain or not? And it was John Quincy Adams who said, no, we should not. We should make our own declaration. We should not be the cockboat riding in the wake of the British man of war, was his statement. And so ultimately that's what was decided upon. James Monroe issued this grand statement that we are now the preeminent power in the Americas, and we do not look favorably on anyone else interfering in our hemisphere. And so that was probably the most significant proclamation of his administration that to this day is looked upon as a milestone. It's the United States who is basically the caretaker of this hemisphere, and everybody else needs to stand back and let us take the lead. This is our territory. So, James Monroe monuments. So we have this one at William and Mary College. This one's in Highland, Virginia. And here's James Monroe tipping his hat to you on the streets of Rapid City. Okay, any questions? James Madison or James Monroe? Yes?
If you visit Orange, you learn more about Madison's stepson, who was a gambler, and who Madison paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, and who took his papers and sold them. Are they beginning to get them back now? Or how's
I believe so. I believe so. Yeah. I'm not entirely familiar with how that's progressing, but I would think that they do. So, anything else? Okay, next week, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Thank you very much.